right. And Wednesday, yes, it is March 25th. Coming in at the 4 o'clock hour p.m. Eastern Standard Time, that is a new slot for Discussions of Truth. Thank you for tuning in. I am the host, Ian Hamilton Trottier, and what a show lined up for you today. That is 4 hours of Discussions of Truth coming your way. Coronavirus may be sparking a little bit of that, but regardless, what we started in 2020 because of demand are double headers. And I believe 2 weeks ago, we had our first triple header. We are now doing a quadruple header Wednesdays at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard. You can find me right here at Wynwood 1, Miami Radio. We formerly broadcast on Wynwood Radio itself. We retain a good working relationship, but we are now broadcasting on Wynwood1.com, Miami Radio, and a number of other platforms. Those include and are discussionsoftruth.com, freedomreserved.com, iantrottier.com, and finally at stopmassmedia.com. Because alternative news is the new news. If you haven't caught on, mass media is completely brainwashing you into occupying space in your brain with really non-essential elements and news that's, again, totally meant to sidetrack and keep you preoccupied. Does the political landscape, in other words, in the United States, seem to you like a reality TV show? Good. I'm glad you're listening. We shall proceed. At the 2:15 mark, at the 15 mark, we'll be receiving a very special guest. Okay? And always at that quarter mark, we receive the day's guest. So if you're listening to this in a post-broadcast platform, i.e. a podcast, iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and you don't want to listen to me, fast forward to that quarter mark. That's when we receive our guest. And that is how it is every discussion of truth. Okay, so at the 5 o'clock hour, the normal slated hour, we're bringing on A. Ralph Epperson. He's an American author and historian. He's got a BA in business from the University of Arizona. He's dedicated over half a century. Ring a bell? If you caught the Jordan Maxwell episode, do so. You can see it and hear it on YouTube. That number of views is dramatically climbing. That is how we brought in 2020, was with Jordan Maxwell. Okay? He's 80 years old, and the knowledge that he has regarding the deep state and the mechanics that run the United States of America are extensive. Catch that episode. A. Ralph Epperson is somewhat of a parallel in regards to intellect. He, again, for a half a century, has been dissecting the American economy and the political makeup. His findings are eye-opening. Historical events, quote, occur by design for reasons that are not generally made known to the people. Zero Hedge was banned by Twitter about a month ago for posting alternative concepts regarding the coronavirus outbreak. They were banned from Twitter. Does that speak to you? It should, because as far as I'm concerned, and I'm not a lawyer by any means, that's a violation of free speech. Okay? So A. Ralph Epperson joins us with what we refer to as the New World Order. He's been studying it now for about 50 years. Following that, we're bringing on a special guest. Okay, like I said, this is a 4-hour program today. Micaiah Freeman will be joining us. Location, I'm not sure where he is, but he will be discussing DC dirty laundry and the 7 New World Order agendas accompanying the coronavirus outbreak. That'll be on at the 6 o'clock hour. So the 5 o'clock hour, we've got A. Ralph Epperson. The 6 o'clock hour, again at that quarter mark of the hour, Micaiah Freeman will be joining us. And today, because of the demand regarding the coronavirus, we'll be joined by J.P. Lindstroth. We will be receiving a Lindstroth report today. Okay? But to open the show, in about 8 minutes, we'll be bringing on, based in the UK, years before Dan Brown's research came to light in form of the Da Vinci Code, Oxford-educated British scholar Tobias Churton will be joining the program. He had long gained notoriety of his work within the Gnostic spirituality realm. His 1987 4-part drama documentary for Channel 4 UK television production, Gnostics, won the New York TV Festival Gold Award. Former Dutch theologian said about Tobias's work for Channel 4 that it would change the minds of millions. As of 2005, Tobias has lectured at Exeter University, where he is an honorary fellow and faculty member. He holds an MA in theology from Brasenose College at Oxford. He's born to the ancient Cheshire family in Sutton Coldfield, UK. Churton is considered Britain's leading scholar of Western Esotericism. He's a filmmaker, he's a poet, he's a composer and author. He's known for acclaimed biographies on William Blake, Elias Ashmole, G.I. Gurdjieff, and Aleister Crowley. Having authored over 20 books, Churton's current publication, Aleister Crowley in India, goes into the travels of Crowley into this mystical land. So, being rescheduled from a January date to today, in about 5 minutes, we'll be joined on Discussions of Truth by Tobias Churton. But before that, okay, I want to address a couple things. And these items are typically of importance with the program and regarding guests that we bring on. If you aren't aware, health around the world is in great jeopardy today. Yes, the coronavirus is exacerbating that. What do we have? About 18,000 deaths at the moment. Okay, this is totally, in large part, overdrawn by media, in my opinion. I'm not saying the coronavirus isn't dangerous. Yes, it is. People are dying. I think at about 500 deaths in the United States alone at the moment. Italy's being obliterated. The Chinese, there's reports that they have it under control. There's reports they don't have it under control. What is a fact is that in the United States it's not under control. But why would Zero Hedge be banned for posting an alternative look at how the outbreak happened? Was it biological warfare? Was it a lapse in security? An accidental outbreak? Does it really come from a bat? I don't really know the virus that well, but I know that the world is in global lockdown. And that right there coincides with the New World Order, almost lock and key. So at about 18,000 deaths, put that in perspective if you've ever caught the flu, which with a healthy immune system, Zika, what I started talking about in 2016 in Miami Beach, to a healthy immune system, Zika caused cold and flu-like symptoms. Well, there's a parallel with that in the coronavirus, isn't there? 290,000 to 650,000 deaths, so at an average 450,000, I guess, deaths annually are caused by cold and flu. Yet only 18,000 deaths so far in a 4-month period from the coronavirus. Is this more of an economic show than it is a health show by the masters that control the economics of the United States? Well, I would argue certainly that yes, that is the case. And I can get into that, but I'm not going to get into it at the moment. I'm going to shift gears because I want to get these 3 points out before we bring Tobias on, because he's standing by. Autism is an epidemic. Now, whether you are for or against vaccines, certainly you should be for some vaccines, but are you for 70 vaccines being pumped into a newborn child? Are you for mandatory vaccines? Okay? Autism, regardless, is an epidemic today. The first autism prevalence study, Trottier, 1970, showed an autism rate of less than 1 out of 10,000 kids. That's 1970. A study from Trottier, 1970. That's Treffert if you want to look it up. Today, the autism in the United States is 1 in 36 kids. That's a study in 2017 by Zablosky. That's Zablotsky. So, we've experienced a 27,000% increase in simply 50 years. Why is that? The garbage that's being fed to us in fast food, the pesticides that are being used in our agriculture, and yes, the chemicals and barium that are being emitted from NASA combating global warming. That is a fact. That is a fact. Well, whether the barium's causing autism, that's not a fact, but it is a fact that those are being emitted from the sky, otherwise known as chemtrails. All right, in California, we go to the coronavirus here. California Governor Gavin Newsom announced plans to use the quarantine right now to expand the deployment of wireless infrastructure in schools, opening the door to deploy 5G. How do you feel about that? Okay, who's pulling his string to get that happening? All right, who's pulling in? Atlanta Freeland's a former guest on the program. That's an excellent look at what's going on in the 5G realm. Man is becoming machine. All right, that seems to be apparent. Man is becoming machine. Okay. Now, lastly, Julian Assange. Whether you feel how you feel in regards to him or not. Kevin Shep, who was on the program just a few weeks ago, former CIA agent. I think he spent 17 years in the CIA, very high level. We've had other former John Kiriakou, other former CIA on the program. John Kiriakou, McCoy. My gosh. Excuse my excuse my lapse in memory here. Ray McGovern, not McCoy. Al McCoy's a different guest, different topic. Ian, we no longer have any real sense of free media. The only hope now is people like you who can repair the damage and get people listening to people who know what they're talking about. That is Ray McGovern on this program. Direct quote, CIA analyst, 1963 to 1990, chaired the National Intelligence Estimates, and prepared the President's Daily Brief from 81 to 85. We've had other CIA on the program. Kevin Ship joined us a few weeks ago, and this is a recent tweet from Kevin. Julian Assange, whether you feel you like him or not, Julian Assange's lawyers now announced that they will be applying for bail at court this Wednesday. That'll be today. They argue that he is in imminent danger from coronavirus spreading through the prison population and should be released for his and other prisoners and staff safety. What is happening worldwide with the coronavirus? We're going to tackle that a little bit more with our next 3 guests, and that would be A. Ralph Epperson, definitely with Makia Freeman, and finally J.P. Lindstroth. Counterpunch, we're going to be going over one of the articles that he's written with through Counterpunch. That'll be at the 7:15 mark, again, the 7 o'clock hour. Okay, this is Discussions of Truth. I am Ian Hamilton Trottier. Look for the book Freedom Reserved, No More Lies, being released next month. That's just a few weeks via Trine Day. You can pre-order right now on Barnes & Noble and at Amazon. Again, Trine Day release. That's the publisher. The book, again, is Freedom Reserved, No More Lies. And donate to the program. Get a shirt. I recommend you get a shirt. Of course, they're soft, very comfortable. You enjoy wearing them to the supermarket or anytime you get let out of your quarantine house, prison. Pardon the lapse in vocabulary there. StopMassMedia.com. You can get those shirts at StopMassMedia.com. No more lies. Okay, now bringing on our first guest today. We're going to Skype him in here. So, here we go.
ear.
Tobias, good evening to you, sir.
You're just in time.
For dinner?
It could be, yes, or a drink if you want one.
Or is it tea time? I know it's late for you. Tobias joins us from the UK. Tobias, I gave listeners a brief description of who you are. You are you're Oxford educated. You are an author. Why don't you give listeners a little bit more about who you are, Tobias? And again, thank you for accepting the invitation in January. We're pleased to have you now in March. Either way.
Delighted to be among you. Difficult to sum up a career that's as long and varied as mine, but I'm a full-time writer. I specialize in writing about spiritual ideas through the ages and many other things as well. Worked in television for a good many years and then became full-time writer. Beyond that, I can only say I'm driven by a spiritual imperative to sort out fact from fantasy and meaningful truth from well, a fantasy, frankly. But great specialization in secret societies, Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, the Gnostic tradition, and many subjects which appeal to many people.
Well, Tobias, that's great. I mean, you're talking about identifying facts in kind of a mystic and Gnostic realm, which would be incredibly hard to do, but you seem to have that. One thing I wanted to point out for listeners, and I mentioned this again in the pre-show, is that Tobias, you are from an ancient UK family, the Cheshire family of Sutton Coldfield. Well, tell us more about that.
Oh well, no, our family, the Churtons, originally come from Cheshire. And we probably came over after William the Conqueror, the Norman, took over England, as I'm sure you all know, in 1066.
Yes.
And the Churtons appear within about 100 years of that, with land just south of Chester, and there's a village of Churton there. And my family has been in Cheshire and Shropshire and now Staffordshire for the last 900 years.
Incredible. I think that's hard for Americans to grasp. Certainly their ancestry, if they've looked at it, gives them a better grasp on it. But having a family located in a specific geographic area of a country of origin, that's obviously not possible for any American to identify with that. So that's a really cool aspect of your history. Of course, now you mentioned William the Conqueror, and this is something that we've discussed on the program. And we've had on the program various people from the UK. In fact, last week we had on Ronan Ronan Palin. He's a professor at the University City University of London. Pardon me. He's an economist, and one of his recent books is The Hidden Nature of Finance Sabotage. And he joined the program with his co-author Anastasia Nesvetalova, and they discussed in brief. Ronan did this a little bit. He went into William the Conqueror because what he talked about, and this is certainly, I don't think this has anything to do with Aleister Crowley, or what you've studied, but perhaps it does. But what he talked about was the banking system in London, the Corporation of London, and the Bank of England, and that being a present mechanism before William the Conqueror, and something that William the Conqueror actually was unable to conquer, and so it's been its intact sovereign entity through the ages, and that continues to this day in 2020. And what he talked about was it being really a medieval form of banking and really a Roman element that continues to exist. Do you have any comments on that, Tobias?
Banks are places that I think I try to avoid most of the time, but my understanding was that the Bank of England was founded in the 17th century, which is a good 600 years or so after William the Conqueror. So that's a news to me. The banking that took place in the Middle Ages, I think, was very different. I'd understood that most of the lenders of money in the Middle Ages in England tended to be Lombard bankers who came from North Italy, who originated terms like bankrupt. When they ran out of money, they would smash the bench they used to sit on. That's the origin of the word bankrupt. So I don't think a sophisticated capitalizing banking that has made the British Empire so successful in its best years really appears until the 17th century. So I'd be very interested in what evidence that I don't think William the Conqueror and people of that type were very interested in lending money. I think they tended to force people to give them money, and when there was a parliament by the 14th century, they would get the House of Commons to vote them money or else. But until the English Revolution, 17th century, kings didn't chat to bankers; they just forced them to do things.
Yeah, but I may be drawing a parallel where I shouldn't with the Bank of England Corporation of London, but that is the information that he conveyed. So let's get in, Tobias. Let's get in a little bit to Aleister Crowley. And of course, tell us exactly what drives you, because Aleister Crowley in India, the secret influence of Eastern mysticism on magic and the occult, certainly is, as far as I know, your recent publication, but you've released prior publications regarding the life of Aleister Crowley. What is it about Aleister Crowley? Tell listeners a little bit about what they need to know about Aleister Crowley, and then we can get into the India portion of what he found in India through his adventures there.
Yeah, Aleister Crowley, it's Crowley as in holy rather than Crowley as in Fowley. Aleister Crowley was the pen name of Edward Alexander Crowley, who was the son of a Plymouth Brethren, which is an exclusive, some would say extreme Protestant sect. His father was a preacher, a wealthy man. He was brought up in a solidly upper middle class family in the late Victorian era, and he rebelled after his father died when he was 12 years old. He rebelled against this heavily Christianized upbringing and embraced girls, card games, fun, but also he took his intellect onto a totally different level, and he wanted to become a diplomat. He went to Cambridge University, and he was all set for a diplomatic career, and he had a kind of revelation that whatever you could achieve as a diplomat, politician, whatever, was of very limited value. And he came to see that human history was ultimately dictated by spiritual powers, and he came to believe this very strongly. But what he made it his life's work was to examine this idea scientifically. And this marks him out as very, very different from so many of the theosophical seekers after spiritual truth of the late Victorian and 20th century. And he carved his own road, founded effectively his own religion, and thelema, from the Greek for will, and which was a magical religion, which of course is still and growing, I think, quietly in the world today, which has been attacked almost since he started. He was attacked by Christian groups at the University of Cambridge, but he then became notorious because his name was used by popular press people to attack existing movements that they did not approve of, and he has probably the worst reputation of any English intellectual in the entire history of the Western world. My job has been to penetrate the myth of Crowley and reveal what I think is a tremendously exciting spirit and intellect of great value to us today.
So from someone who wanted to engage in politics and then shifting into developing his own religion, and you're mentioning thelema, what was the turning point for him that said, "Hey, this is more spiritually driven than it is other things"? What was it that he discovered that kind of opened that path for him?
Well, it was a series of progressive events in his life. One of the first was when he joined a Masonic para order it was founded by Grand Lodge British Freemasons, which is called the Order of the Golden Dawn, which was founded for you could say advanced Masons who were interested in Rosicrucian mythology, spirituality, and basically the occult, as it was considered in those days. Not black magic, but was considered white magic, Hermetic magic. He joined that in 1898 when he was barely out of Cambridge, and joined it at a time when it was embroiled in a sort of infra-struggle. W.B. Yeats, the poet, was a member at the time. There were a lot of bright characters in it, and a lot of eccentrics. But he got very tired of it very quickly. He felt it wasn't really getting to the sort of magical load, mother load. The next event which really made an impact was he had an independent fortune in his early years, and he was traveling the world. And he was in Cairo with his wife on their honeymoon, and he had the most extraordinary series of experiences, which led to, in 3 days sitting in a room in the center of Cairo, he wrote a thing which later became called the Book of the Law, or rather it was dictated to him, he believed, by a preternatural entity, an angel of the Most High, whose name was given as Iwas. And the whole thing, as he knew, sounded preposterous. He never doubted anyone who said this is absurd. But the Book of the Law is there, it can be read, and you can interpret it how you will. It's one of the most extraordinary pieces of writing in English, I think, that has ever been known, and still has huge enigmatic characteristics. He himself tried to deny it for many years. I don't think he really wanted the idea of, he didn't want to be the start of a cult. And but his life was buffeted to the extent that eventually he sort of accepted the role that the Book of the Law laid out for him, which was a new revelation that the basic dispensation which was governing the planet had changed in 1904 in April at the time of his writing. I mean, it sounds utterly preposterous. And, but the more you go into it, the more he held this belief to the end of his days. He was the intimate of many extraordinarily minded people. He knew Einstein. He knew Schrödinger. He was. This isn't a sort of do-it-yourself astrologer.
Right.
You make it up. This was a highly brilliant man. Been compared to Winston Churchill. It's sort of been called the Churchill of the occult. And his biggest following turned out to be, before he died, was in the United States.
Well, that's a good thing. I would assume, but you talk about Cairo, so this is interesting because on the back of the United States $1 note is what many consider to be the pyramid there in Giza. I'm sure you're familiar with this, and so there is, maybe Crowley was on to some type of a pathway that resonates through various civilizations historically in regards to this spiritual enlightening. Did he visit the assuming that this pyramid on the back of the U.S. $1 note it does come from Egypt, and we do know there's other pyramids around the world. But was he able to visit the Giza pyramids, and what was his thought regarding those buildings?
Yeah, well, in 1903, this was about 4 months or so. 5 months before what he calls the Cairo revelation of April 1904, he'd been shown into the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid, and he did an invocation of the sylphs, which he'd been taught the words for this invocation when he was in the Golden Dawn. And he said that the room he was in with his wife, and that the room kept a sort of bluish glow for most of the night before it faded, and very much impressed his wife as to the magical powers that he had. He didn't go a bundle on the whole pyramidology you get today and the amazing amount of measuring and symbolism that people attach the same kind of symbolic importance to the Great Pyramid as they used to the Temple of Solomon, Isaac Newton. All of these great monuments of the past attract this tremendous level of speculation. Crowley wasn't terribly bothered about the speculation, but he was fascinated as a romantic by being in the pyramid at that time. Crowley was very much a sort of down-to-earth, practical bloke in one way, which is quite extraordinary given the depth of his mysticism. He's not a man that's easy to describe, and when people you can write him off, but you haven't written anything off. You've simply thrown something in the image against the image. The reason I've written several books on Crowley is I've always found discovering more aspects to him and to his life which are worth our interest. Today, why should they be of interest? Because we're going through this incredible change, and we have been since the end of the Victorian era. The old world that our great-great-great-grandparents knew has been ripped up entirely, technologically, morally, politically. We are still going through a most extraordinary maelstrom. And while we had a sort of brief break in the 1950s when normal became heaven after the horrors of the war, Second World War, World War II, we're back on the roller coaster again with all these issues about what is man, why is he here, what's our relationship with nature. All of that is thrown into the air again, and as we are now facing a new kind of apocalyptic scenario. Somebody like Crowley, who was not afraid of confronting the facts of change, becomes terribly interesting, I think.
Yeah, I think you've got a nice example, if you will, to study. One of the thoughts that comes to my mind is in modern media, the culture today is gravitated to this 007 figure from Ian Fleming, and that would be, as far as I know, John Dee. It does what John Dee did for the British Crown with this 007 for Your Eyes Only. He's more espionage, but there's also a Gnostic realm to what he did. Is my thought. Are there any parallels between the two great figures in British history? That would be John Dee and Aleister Crowley.
Yes, I think that there's a remarkable symbiosis there. John Dee was of great interest to Crowley, and Crowley explored Dee's angel summoning system, which came to him through his scryer, Edward Kelly. And Crowley probably did more experimental work on that than practically anybody, and came up with a mighty tome, which you can still buy, called The Vision and the Voice. Where Dee is interesting is because, well, for many reasons, but basically Dee had explored Renaissance learning, come to its limits, and then wanted to go further. He wanted to eventually find out what was known beyond the human dimension altogether, and that's why he got involved in this extraordinary step into summoning angels for guidance. Now, Dee did work for the British government, or rather the British government under Elizabeth I, time of the founding of Virginia, was very interested in what he was doing, and sent people to, when he was in Europe, sent them to follow what he was doing. Dee could have been an agent of the British Crown at that time. He was certainly privy to many of the leading figures of the Elizabethan court. Crowley would like to have had a role very much like that, I think. He tried very hard to get the government to take him on as practically anything: advisor, guide, magus, spy. He did quite a lot of attempted espionage for the British cause and the Allied cause in World War I, much of which was grossly misunderstood. He tried to serve the government again in World War II. He certainly was helping MI5 with information about communist subversion in England in World War II. But I think ultimately it wasn't a secular state, of course, in the 1580s when Dee was most active. But in the 20th century, it's just simply very hard for a modern state to employ a figure who is so tuned into non-political categories, and whose fundamental interests are almost wholly spiritual. A state can't afford, as it were, to listen to that kind of guidance in the modern world. But there are always people within the state system who are interested in the highest kind of intelligence. And Crowley was certainly fit that bill, and he was a great interest to some of the spy masters of Great Britain in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, including Maxwell Knight and Colonel Carter. And
yep.
But he never had the role that he deserved. I think one of the sad things about Crowley was he became a martyr, really. His enemies were very great, and he was opposed on many sides. And it's not surprising, because his entire public stance was one of defiance of convention. And he was, to start with, a decadent poet. He belongs in the 1890s in some way, and in other ways I think he belongs in the 2090s. I don't think his era has quite come. He's extraordinary character, very difficult to express to you in a brief interview.
Yeah, and certainly great musicians like the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper's, Led Zeppelin, I believe. Some of these great musicians have credited, haven't they, Crowley's work and to inspire them. Is that accurate?
Oh, there's no doubt of that. I mean, Mick Jagger, John Lennon, David Bowie, Jimmy Page, they've all taken some idea of Crowley. It may not be an accurate idea in some of the cases, but I remember John Lennon, just before the terrible murder in 1980, was interviewed by Newsweek, and he summed up his basic stance as being, "Do what thou willst, but don't hurt anybody." Now that is an obvious paraphrase of Crowley's "Do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law, and love is the law, love under will." So Lennon had certainly got the message, but he didn't. He put it over subtly. So Crowley appears on the cover of the Sgt. Pepper album. Jimmy Page put "Do What Thou Wilt" on the lead-out groove of Led Zeppelin 3, the one with "Stairway to Heaven," and he's still the owner of probably the largest collection of Aleister Crowley's paintings in the world. David Bowie mentions Crowley in the Golden Dawn in several of his early songs. I think we did get in touch with David Bowie some years ago to get a comment on the biography of Crowley I wrote, and he sort of, it was a bit sheepish. He wished it well, but he said his Crowley interest was a bit in the past. I also contacted Peter Brook, the great theatre director, and you get this. They like Crowley, but they don't want to be known to like him too much, because the public image of Crowley is still, regardless of all the scholarship I brought to it, doesn't matter what I say, the newspapers still want Crowley devil worshipping, drug taking, sex mad, heroin addict. That's the Crowley they want. It's tragic, but it's true, and it's lessened a bit, but he's a very. I took the Crowley case on in a way a bit like a lawyer who likes a challenge, because I recognise that the world, constituted as it is never going to give this guy a chance. Doesn't matter what I say, but even so, somebody should say, "You're getting it wrong."
Yeah, well said, Tobias. Let's get into that before, because I want to spend some time in India with Crowley, but let's identify some of his adversaries. Certainly, he's pushing the norm. He's bringing in an alternative. He's kind of pushing out, wanting to push out the establishment in a sense. But he must have been, he's started this religion. He's got followers. So what he's learning and researching is obviously becoming somewhat of a threat, because he's creating opposing forces in humanity in that sense. He's got, if you will, enemies, to use that perhaps too strong of a term. But he's doing so in a sense that is causing a disturbance. So who is it? What are the sectors of society, if you will, that are becoming opposed to what he's doing? Are we able to identify some of those?
That is a very difficult task, because I don't think Crowley was opposed by whole sectors of society at all. It tended to be the first time we get him being actively opposed is the University of Cambridge Christian Union. You have in these universities groups of fervent evangelical Christians who make it their effort to bring people to Jesus, and it was just the same in the 1890s as you'll probably find in universities today. They didn't like the fact that he was advocating. He joined what was called the Pan Society. These were today's sort of Greens in a way, a kind of romantic vision of nature, and trying to talk about the classical gods, Pan, the god of all of nature, and so on. That was that was obviously paganism. So he was identified as a sort of pagan who was trying to undermine the good Christian education. So that was the first opposition. I think after that it became rumored that Crowley was bisexual. He occasionally had relationships, strong relationships with men, though most of his relationships are with women. And he was certainly a proto-feminist, as not as perhaps would be understood today, but certainly would have been understood in 1900. I think when the sexuality aspect of Crowley got out, he became prey to blackmail, because of course in those days it was not a capital crime. It was, you could be sent to prison for years and hard labor, as had happened to Oscar Wilde, if you could be proved, if you've had homosexual acts. And several editors of low magazines tried to blackmail Crowley, and he always refused to be blackmailed, so they would print what they liked about him. I suppose you could say that his enemy would be the right-wing Christian establishment. Certainly, but actually the serious papers, the big newspapers, the Times, etc., never attacked Crowley at all. It was always what you call the yellow press. In America, that would be the Hearst press.
Tobias, well said. Well said, Tobias. Okay, do you have a few? You have something else?
Well, I think he had a lot of opposition from the Roman Catholic Church. Because he's basically Gnostic, and from the 1890s, the Vatican was very concerned that there had in the 1890s appeared a new Gnostic church led by Gilles Douanel in Paris, and they were very frightened that there was going to be this outbreak of what they would regard as heresy. So Crowley touches on that as well. He wrote a Gnostic Mass when he was in Russia in 1913. He has opposition from the Catholic Church. He had opposition from Theosophy, the Theosophical Society, because he opposed Krishnamurti, whom Annie Besant, the leader of the Theosophical Society after Blavatsky died in the 1890s. They tried to undermine him and said he's a dangerous character, and he's too iconoclastic, and he's probably satanic, and so he got opposition there as well. But if you trace the intelligentsia and their relationship to Crowley, some of them were frightened of him. Definitely, he had an amazingly powerful image, which put some people off and attracted others. But I think a lot of his opposition was just certain individuals who had great power in the state, who just didn't want this man's conception of message imagery to affect anybody. And I think he was singled out quite early on as being somebody, Oscar Wilde times 10.
Yeah. What part of Russia had he written that mass?
Well, in 1913, very interesting, he went to Moscow. Why did he go? Very interesting. It's very unclear why he went. He'd originally gone to St. Petersburg in the 1890s to learn Russian, to train to be a diplomat. But he was there in 1913 mostly. He took over. He took an English band, I suppose today you'd say, like a rock band, a group of 7 girls called the Ragged Ragtime Girls, and he put them on as their manager in Moscow, and at the famous place called the Aquarium, and they strutted their stuff, and he spent his time getting to know people in various cities and hanging out with the British consulate, and getting to know the leading diplomats in Moscow. Fascinating little tour in 1930, and I think Scriabin was aware of him. The Russian artistic movement that died sadly with the Russian Revolution. They were aware of this extraordinary Englishman, this Magus, who'd come along. Ken Russell, the movie director, actually wrote a play having Scriabin and Crowley together in St. Basil's Cathedral, sacrificing goats, but that's more Ken Russell's imagination than Crowley's. But it's a delight to go back into that pre-First World War world Crowley was so much part of, a period that we've so long forgotten. When in many houses in America and England, families would get together and have seances. I mean, this is long gone now, but I remember talking to my grandmother about this. And before the First World War, there was a kind of popular occultism, and in that world, you had competing figures. You had Vivekananda, the Indian guru, and a lot of people followed him. You had the Theosophical Society, you had Freemasonry. All these things were competing for people's private spiritual space.
Yeah.
And Crowley was sort of part of that, but he's kind of very much more modern. You get that when you read Crowley's original writings, you get this feeling that he was well in touch with a future time. And he makes probably more sense now in some ways, even though the culture's changed so much.
That's remarkable, and he seems like a very peaceful fellow that wasn't inciting any violence. He was simply kind of what you're alluding to, going against that the overall Christian norm at the time through the Vatican and whatnot, maybe elements left throughout Europe, and that was kind of a threat, perhaps. Let's get into Tobias. Let's get into India. What drew Crowley to India? What practices of Hinduism? What was it? And then what did he get out of India?
Well, his engagement with India, which is the new book's main topic. I anyway wanted to write a book which explained to everyone today what we mean when we talk about Indian philosophy, Vedanta, and Buddhism, and these things that people tend to confuse and mix up, and the main schools of Indian philosophy. So in one way, Crowley was my excuse to write about Indian religion and philosophy. But the more I got into it, Crowley's own engagement with India was profound and fascinating. He came to India because his best friend in London, who was a very poor chap, an electrical chemist called Alan Bennett, who was one of the most brilliant young men of the Golden Dawn organization. He got tired of magic. He trained Crowley in magic. They'd done all sorts of experiments, invocations, evocations at Crowley's flat, and Bennett was terribly ill with asthma, and Crowley arranged money to be provided so he could go to Ceylon, which was thought to be much better for asthmatics. And Bennett wanted to go because his heart's desire was to study Buddhism and to become a Buddhist. And he'd read classics of Buddhism, and he thought, this is better than magic. Magic's piddling around on the bottom of the mountain, and he wanted to go to the peak. Bennett, off he went to India. Crowley went mountaineering in Mexico, went to America, and then in 1901 he set sail from San Francisco to go and see his old friend, Alan Bennett, who was lecturing at the Theosophical Lodge in Colombo in Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka. And Bennett trained him in Raj Yoga. And Crowley made great advances in the company of Bennett in Ceylon in 1901, and became effectively a Buddhist, and thought he was a Buddhist, and was very seriously interested in leading a sort of conversion group, a Buddhist Sangha, to come to Britain and announce the new Buddhist era. I'll give you an example. He sent out Christmas cards in Christmas 1904 saying, "Wishing you a speedy termination of existence." That was his take on Buddhism. And so he studied the high trances of the Theravada Buddhism in Ceylon, and then he went over to mainland India and went to Calcutta and then across India, exploring everything he could find before attempting the world's first ever attempt on K2, the world's second highest mountain, which he was a leader of that expedition with Oscar Eckenstein, his friend, which was a pioneering expedition. Oscar Eckenstein, his best mate in mountaineering, invented the crampon, without which people wouldn't.
My goodness, yeah.
And this was 1902, and it was an incredible attempt. They had no oxygen. It was all done. They went up there in clothes today you would hardly think suitable for a weekend in the Adirondacks, and they went up K2 in this stuff, and most incredible. And Crowley was suffering from malaria, and he's at the highest point anyone's ever spent on any mountain.
Oh,
and
wow.
he's writing a play on the mountain in howling winds, virtually frozen to death, at the highest point any man's ever been. Quite absolutely extraordinary guy we're talking about here. And he then, in 1905, he went back to India and took on Kanchenjunga on the Nepal-Sikkimese border. And that wasn't climbed, in fact, till the 1950s. So again, 1905, well ahead of his time. And he led that expedition. It ended in tragedy. There was several people killed, but still an incredible achievement. And I managed to get some fabulous photographs of these very early pioneering mountaineering expeditions. This idea, you are a mountaineer, you're also a poet, you're also a mystic. This is what attracted me to Crowley in the first place, because I was interested in all those three things: mountaineering, poetry, and mysticism. So that's how my original interest started, when I was at Oxford studying theology, and I joined the Mountaineering Society. And
that's incredible.
That's where I first heard about him.
But he's really pushing the physical limits as he's pushing spiritual boundaries, in a sense.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. His whole system is the bringing together of the physical and the spiritual. That's one of the distinctions of it.
Tobias, I want listeners to hear briefly and if there is any overlapping, what is the Da Vinci Code in your? And this is just totally off subject here. What are your thoughts on the Da Vinci Code? It's been a number of years since that was a mainstream item of interest. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, the Da Vinci Code is one of these splashes that you get every so often that introduce a huge audience who'd never really thought much about it into the whole mystical, magical world. And Dan Brown has achieved that with that book, even though the subject matter of the book, of course, was well explored before by Michael Bagent and Richard Lee. I knew Michael Bagent very well, and Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince's books. But he took that and created a story out of it. The essence of things like the Da Vinci Code goes back to what I call occult Paris of the 1890s. It was Joséphin Pelledin who said that Da Vinci was a grand master of the occult inheritance of the secret doctrine through history. He didn't mean by that it was an order of Zion or anything like that. Pelledin, who was the great occult showman of the early 1890s in Paris, was trying to create a new artistic movement which brought spirituality into art and art into spirituality. And he wanted to lead religion back to this Gnostic experience of the inner revelation that comes to people who strive within and don't simply accept what is fed from without. And Paladin invented this whole thing of Da Vinci. So the real, if you want to know what the true Da Vinci Code is, read Occult Paris, which is a book I wrote some years ago to explain how all this came about. People took the novel as if it was fact because he said it was based on facts. Well, yes, I could write a book based on facts, but it wouldn't necessarily be fact. You can base a lot of fiction on fact, can't you? And I mean, we wouldn't have a movie industry if that wasn't the case.
Correct.
Or indeed a political system, frankly. The Da Vinci Code was one of those gateway books that allows people to come into this marvelous field of what we call Western Esotericism, which is the inner meaning of spiritual beliefs, and that is a field which is growing in terms of its scholarship and discipline, and I've been trying to pioneer that process as well. These subjects should come under very serious purview. It shouldn't just be left to popularizations. Otherwise, you end up with a guru on every street corner with the answer to his own insanity. We don't need bad gurus. What we want to know is what do all these things mean?
Right.
And that's what my work's all been about, is to clarify the field.
I liked how you thread in the political system. That was a nice. There was a nice thread you made there, Tobias. In winding down here, please let listeners know where they can find your books. I'd imagine most retailers. Do you have a website? And share, give listeners a place they can go to purchase your work and find out more about what you do, and share with us some closing thoughts, if you would.
Well, I'll try. I have a website, tobiaschurton.com. Tobias Churton, CHURTON, tobiaschurton.com, and all the books and all my works and biography and all that stuff is all listed on there. If you go to Amazon and look up Tobias Churton, you'll find all the books at least, and that no problem getting them through Amazon. And I think all the good bookshops and Barnes and Noble and in the United States stock my books. Recently, I have had a wonderful relationship with Inner Traditions International of Vermont, and they published a lot of my books. I'm very, very lucky, and they've done a fantastic job. So Inner Traditions International is a very good. They have their own website, catalogs, and all that stuff. And now, as for parting thoughts, I would say that we are faced today with some of the most confusing and confused messages that have ever been put in large numbers to human beings. And I would say follow your profoundest intuition, find some space to think about what might be happening, and listen a bit less to the media. And I'm not talking about fake news, because all news to somebody is fake news, Fake news is the news you don't want to hear sometimes. And the true news is what's happening to you and how you feel, and what's going on in your life. That's the true news. And you ask your own questions and follow your own path.
Well said. Thank you, Tobias. Some great words, ladies and gentlemen. Tobias Churton. Tobias, thanks for the reschedule, and we look forward to reaching back out to you, inviting you back on the program.
That'd be a great pleasure, Ian. Thank you very much for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, Tobias Churton, sorry for that delay there. What you've got is really an incredible concept. Tobias himself, of course, highly educated, doing work and studying and writing books on another very intelligent human being. Aleister Crowley, and I guess if I were to have some parting thoughts here, it would be give some meditation, give some time thinking about the comment that Tobias made regarding politics. Gnosticism and politics, how do the two thread together? Okay, now with that said, as you meditate, consider this thought. What you're looking at during Crowley's time in regards to his opposition. Why was there opposition? He's not hurting anybody. He's not inciting violence. His sexuality is his own business. That's a opinion coming in 2020, and I would assume he would have that same opinion in 1900. However, laws change. Societal norms change, and what he was looking at was look, if you break down the makeup of Europe in regards to countries, it was once all ruled by Rome. And let's take the neighbor to the south of the United States. Let's look at Mexico, for example. And I've got to be quick here with my thoughts. We'll be bringing on a Ralph Epperson here shortly. The thought is this. You've got the Spanish conquistadores that push out the existing population that occupied the land, known as the Native Americans. You've got Aztecs, you've got Mayans. They've pushed them out. And in many cases, these native inhabitants were forced to conform to this new Spanish European system that was spearheaded by Catholicism. In many ways,